Welcome to the Deep Dive. We cut through the noise, get straight to the core research, and give you the insights you need. No overload, just clarity. Today, we're tackling something massive, Africa's energy challenge, and we're doing it by focusing on one key piece of research: repercussion of large-scale hydro dam deployment. The case of Congo Grand Inga Hydro Project.
Yeah, our mission here is to really break down what this study says. Is a giant hydropower project like Grand Inga the answer the continent needs? Or, are there better, maybe cleaner ways forward now? We'll unpack the findings, and you might actually be surprised by some of them. They really challenge some long-held ideas about these kinds of mega projects.
Exactly. This study we're looking at, it's a deep dive in itself. It meticulously picks apart the economics, the social impacts, the environmental side of Grand Inga and the DRC, and then it looks at what that means for Sub-Saharan Africa, SSA as a whole. It's comprehensive, looking at a project that's been talked about and argued about for decades. And when we say Grand Inga, the ambition is just, well, it's staggering. We're talking up to 42 gigawatts. 42. If it ever gets fully built, that would make it the single largest hydropower source on the planet. It's more than just a dam. It's this monumental vision. Harnessing the Congo River. And immense is definitely the right word for that river. It's the second biggest in the world by flow rate. Something like 42,000 cubic meters per second. Just imagine that force.
And what's fascinating looking back is how it was justified initially. Proponents always saw it as, the key piece in a bigger regional energy plan for Africa. The idea was this is how you bridge that huge energy gap: power for millions, fuel for industry across the region. That was the dream.
Okay, but here's where it gets, well, really interesting. Because this grand vision has a pretty troubled past. This study really highlights the history of the existing dams, Inga 1 and Inga 2. Inga 1 came online back in 72, about 350 megawatts. Inga 2 in 82, adding another, 1,400 megawatts or so?
Yeah, and critically, the study points out that those first dams were built, even though feasibility studies at the time said they were, quote, uneconomical, and they actually exceeded what the DRC even needed for electricity back then. So right away, that raises a few questions about the decision-making for future phases. And the financial hit was enormous. The paper shows Inga 1 and 2 ended up contributing to over half, think about that, over half of the DRC's current external debt.
Over half. Wow.
Yeah.
From just those two initial dams.
Yes. And take the transmission line, the big one, from Inga to Kolwezi, over 1,700 kilometers. Its cost didn't just rise, it quadrupled. Jumped from the estimate to $1 billion US. That line alone was a huge factor in the DRC's debt crisis in the 90s. I mean, imagine trying to manage an economy when half your foreign debt is tied to projects that aren't even working right.
And they weren't working right. That's another key point from the research. Operationally, things were a mess. By 2002, those dams were only running at about 40% capacity. Just 40%.
Right. And the reasons. The study lists them: lack of maintenance, financial mismanagement, corruption, and poor governance. It's a whole cocktail of problems.
It really paints a sobering picture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How these huge, ambitious projects can just go so wrong, leaving this legacy of debt and, well, underperformance.
And it forces you to ask that crucial question. If the early, smaller phases had these kinds of systemic problems, what does that tell us about the next phases? The full Grand Inga, remember, is projected at over $80 billion. That was nearly 3 times the DRC's entire GDP back in 2011. The scale is just, it's hard to grasp, especially with that history.
Okay, so the finances are shaky, the operations were troubled, but the cost wasn't just in dollars, was it? This study also looks at the environmental side. Let's shift there. Beyond the kilowatts and the debt, what's the ecological footprint, the human cost?
Well, the Congo Basin itself it's globally critical. It's the second biggest tropical forest, the world's largest tropical swamp. People call it the lungs of the earth, right alongside the Amazon. The biodiversity is just stunning. The paper lists thousands of species: birds, reptiles, mammals, unique gorillas, chimps, and plants. Over 35,000 species, many endemic, some endangered. It's irreplaceable.
And yet, sustainability. This study says it was pretty much ignored by the stakeholders for Inga 1 and 2, just disregarded. It wasn't until 2014, decades later, that the World Bank approved funding just $73 million for an environmental and social impact study for the next phase, Inga 3. Meanwhile, the existing dams already divert 30% of the Congo River's water. 30%.
Yeah.
That's a huge chunk of a major world river.
And then there's the greenhouse gas issue, which is something people often miss with hydro. Reservoirs, especially, it turns out, in tropical regions like the Congo, they actually produce significant amounts of methane, CH4. And methane, as you know, is the second biggest greenhouse gas after CO2 in terms of impact. The paper notes that in some reservoirs, methane can be up to 70% of the total emissions.
70% from a clean hydro dam.
Exactly. Globally, the estimates cited suggest large dams release around 104 teragrams. That's 104 trillion grams of methane every year. That's maybe 1.3 to 1.5% of all global methane emissions. Not insignificant.
So these environmental costs, which, let's be honest, advocates often kind of gloss over, they're real and they're long-lasting. You mentioned the potential impact on the Congo plume, this massive carbon sink. It really makes you rethink the whole green energy label for these specific kinds of large tropical hydro projects. Right, let's get back to the economics then. Because this study dives deep into the financial modeling, comparing Grand Inga to other options, and this is where the numbers get really, really stark.
They do. The research looks at cost overruns, which are notorious for megadams. It finds large hydro projects typically escalate by an average of 71%. 71%. And other studies they cite found costs ended up being, on average, 96% higher than the initial estimates, nearly double.
96% on average, that's astounding.
It is. Now, compare that to wind projects. Their average overrun is about 7.7%, and solar PV, just 1.3%. The difference is just monumental. It changes the whole equation.
And what really jumped out at me reading this was how the study identified these specific tipping points. For the year 2030, if Grand Inga's costs overrun by more than 35%, just 35, it stops being economically beneficial for the entire SSA region. Considering that historical average is almost 100% overrun, well, 35% doesn't seem like much breathing room at all.
It's not. And it gets even more striking when you look out to 2040. For 2040, that threshold drops to minus 5%. That means, according to this analysis, even at the announced cost, so even if it miraculously comes in exactly on budget, by 2040, Grand Inga would actually have a negative economic effect for the region. It would make electricity more expensive overall.
More expensive, even if built on budget. That completely flips the script.
It does. And look at the impact specifically within the DRC. If you model significant overruns, say 100%, which is close to the historical average, the study projects the levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE, basically the true cost per unit of energy. That LCOE in the DRC could jump by over 42% in 2030 and almost 47% in 2040. Nearly 50% higher electricity costs for Congolese consumers and businesses driven by this one project's overruns.
That's a crushing burden, especially for a developing nation. It pushes affordable power further out of reach.
Absolutely. And this data, as the paper puts it, directly challenges that inaccurate, prevalent perception that mega dams can provide the least cost electricity. For years, that's been the assumption, right? Big dam equals cheap power for development. This study says, hold on, let's look at the real numbers, the real risks. The financial reality might be very different.
So if the numbers for Grand Inga look that shaky, especially those overrun risks, what's the alternative? Does the study point towards a different path for powering sub-Saharan Africa?
Oh, absolutely. Overwhelmingly, the model points to solar PV, photovoltaics, and wind energy. They come out as the least cost energy solution for the region. And a huge factor is the cost of solar. The paper emphasizes how PV costs have just plummeted down 80% since late 2009, and they're still falling. It's completely changed the game.
8% drop. Okay, that's transformative.
It really is, and the projections show it. Solar PV dominates the future energy mix in all scenarios in this study. Installed capacity hits around 170 gigawatts in 2030 and then explodes to 600 gigawatts by 2040.
600 gigawatts of solar. Wow, what about wind?
Wind plays a significant role too, definitely part of the least cost mix, though its share tends to decrease a bit over time in the model as solar just keeps getting cheaper and cheaper.
Okay, the economics make sense for solar and wind.
Yeah.
But the classic question, right? Reliability. What happens when the sun's down or the wind drops? How does this study address grid stability with all these renewables?
That's the crucial next piece, and the study tackles it directly. Battery storage. It's identified as absolutely essential for making this work, both for stability and cost effectiveness. The model shows battery capacity ramping up massively from around 230 gigawatt hours in 2030 to 1,500 gigawatt hours in 2040.
1,500 gigawatt hours? That's enormous storage capacity.
It is. And its dominance, the study says, is because it pairs so well with solar PV, and its costs are also falling fast. Batteries basically soak up excess solar during the day and discharge it when needed. They smooth everything out.
So they deal with the intermittency. But what about the grid itself? Can it handle that much power coming from sources that don't have, the big spinning turbines of traditional plants?
Yeah, great question. The paper actually analyzes that specifically. It looks at something called ARCOCO rate of change of frequency. Think of it like the grid's heartbeat stability. Too much fluctuation and things go dark. They found that relying only on traditional synchronous generation, those big turbines, can actually lead to unstable grids in some scenarios. The heartbeat fluctuates too wildly. But, and this is key when you add renewables equipped with synthetic inertia, which is basically smart, fast-reacting power electronics, especially from batteries, but also wind and solar. They act like a digital shock absorber. They bring those frequency changes right down to safe, manageable levels. Study shows maximum RCOG values become very stable, like 0.16 to 0.21 hertz per second, well within limits.
So the technology exists to make a heavily renewable grid stable.
Exactly. The study concludes it's not just theoretically possible, it's technically sound. This renewable future is robust.
So wrapping that section up, what's the big picture takeaway for energy policy in the region, according to this research?
The study confirms that a 100% RE-based system is reachable and a real policy option in SSA. That's a powerful statement. A system led by solar, backed by wind, balanced by batteries, with existing hydro and maybe some biomass playing a smaller gap-filling role, not the lead role. It's a totally different energy paradigm.
Okay, a different paradigm. But that brings us to another critical question, one the paper also addresses. Who is all this power actually for? Is Grand Inga, this massive project, really about bringing electricity to the millions who don't have it? Or is it serving a different agenda?
Well, the finding here is pretty stark. The paper states clearly that power from Grand Inga is not envisioned for supplying electricity to domestic users or increase electricity access to rural areas.
Yeah.
And that's striking because, as the study notes, 95% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa without electricity live in those rural areas. So there's a huge mismatch.
95% live rurally.
Yep.
The power isn't aimed there, so where is it going?
According to the planning documents analyzed, it's intended for points of high demand, such as cities and industrial centers, or to be exported. The paper draws parallels with older megadams like Kariba and Cahora Bassa, which mostly powered mines, industries, and cities, largely bypassing the rural majority. It seems like a similar pattern.
Which makes you ask, how does that square with development goals? Like Sustainable Development Goal 7, SDG 7, aiming for universal energy access by 2030? If this giant project isn't designed to reach the vast majority who lack power, what kind of development is it actually driving? Is it equitable?
And the study contrasts this large-scale approach with what's happening on the ground with off-grid renewables, things like solar home systems, local mini-grids. These are described as less capital-intensive and much better suited to actually ensure electricity access to millions in SSA, particularly in rural areas. You see the boom in pay-as-you-go solar in East and West Africa already. It's a different model, much more distributed, directly tackling energy poverty where it's most acute.
So if it's not primarily for domestic electrification, what's driving Grand Inga? The paper mentions external pressures.
Yes, it notes that the project has often been justified mainly as part of this regional energy master plan. And it explicitly says external forces from developers in South Africa are the major drivers.
South Africa, what's their interest specifically?
The study details South Africa's state utility, Eskom, wanting to secure a large chunk 2.5 gigawatts from the proposed Inga 3 phase. This is mainly for its mining industry and growing urban demand. Compare that to only 1 gigawatt allocated to the DRC's own state utility from that phase. It highlights where the priorities might lie.
So more power potentially flowing south than staying for domestic use in the host country.
That appears to be the plan outlined. And interestingly, the paper adds that South Africa itself has excellent domestic solar and wind resources. Excellent. Which does raise the question, why push for massive hydro import from the DRC with all the associated risks and costs we've discussed when potentially cheaper, cleaner domestic options are available? It adds another layer of complexity to the motivations.
Okay, let's try and pull all these threads together then. We've covered a lot from this deep dive into repercussion of large-scale hydro dam deployment. The case of Congo Grand Inga hydro project. What are the absolute core takeaways?
I think the fundamental point this study makes is that these large-scale hydro projects, especially like Grand Inga, given their history and projected costs, are just highly unlikely to compete economically anymore. Not when you compare them to the fast development and continuous cost decline of solar PV and wind energy, particularly when you factor in those almost inevitable cost overruns and the significant environmental baggage they carry.
So the economics just don't stack up anymore, especially compared to renewables.
That's what the modeling strongly suggests, and therefore the paper calls for energy planners across sub-Saharan Africa to really strike a balance between industrial energy needs and the crucial goal of human development, of energy access for all.
It's not necessarily either, but needs careful thought about who benefits and at what cost.
Precisely. And crucially, the study concludes based on the technical and economic analysis that a 100% RE-based system is reachable and a real policy option in SSA. Phew. It's not some distant dream. It's viable now, led by solar and wind, balanced by batteries. That's the path the data points towards.
A viable path based on the data. So that leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. Considering everything we've unpacked from repercussion of large-scale hydro dam deployment, the case of Congo Grand Inga hydro project, the difficult history, the huge financial risks, the environmental impacts, and especially the incredible progress in falling costs of solar, wind, and batteries. Does betting big on one single colossal, historically troubled project like Grand Inga still make sense as the best way to power sub-Saharan Africa's future? Or does all this evidence point towards a smarter path, one that's more diverse, more distributed, faster to deploy, and ultimately more likely to deliver sustainable and equitable energy for everyone? Something to think about.